Waking up in Ethan Miller's arms was not part of the itinerary, and neither was the terrifying realization that I didn't want to move. That was the first thought that crossed Caleb Brooks's mind when pale morning light slipped through the thin curtains of the cabin and painted the wooden ceiling in soft gold. For 3 full seconds, he did not breathe. The room smelled like cooling coffee, damp pine, and the faint smoky sweetness of last night's fireplace. Rain still tapped gently against the windows, no longer angry, just tired, like the storm had worn itself out and left the world quieter than before. Caleb lay perfectly still beneath a faded quilt, his cheek pressed against a pillow that was definitely not his socked feet tangled near the edge of a bed that suddenly felt much smaller than a queen. Behind him, Ethan was asleep, one arm resting loosely across Caleb's waist, not possessive, not dramatic, just heavy and warm in the careless way people held on to something when they finally felt safe. Caleb stared at the opposite wall, where Ethan's blueprints had been taped up crookedly beside Caleb's camera bag, and tried to remember the exact moment the universe had lost its mind. 24 hours earlier, Ethan Miller had been the most irritating man in Vermont, maybe in all of New England. He was 28, tall, calm, and so carefully put together that even his flannel looked like it had been approved by an architectural review board. He designed spaces for a living, which apparently gave him the confidence to rearrange not only furniture, but also the emotional temperature of every room he entered. Caleb, 26, freelance food photographer, professional oversharer, and unofficial disaster with a lens, had arrived at the Maple and Hearth Festival with 2 cameras, 1 duffel bag, 3 unpaid invoices, and a half-eaten cinnamon donut from a gas station outside Burlington. He had expected a cozy weekend of apple cider, pumpkin soup, and golden leaves. He had not expected Ethan, who glanced at Caleb's equipment case, then at Caleb's wrinkled jacket, and said, "You travel light for someone responsible for visual memory." Caleb had smiled with all the politeness his mother had taught him and replied, "And you sound expensive for someone standing next to a folding table." That should have been the end of it. 2 adults, 1 festival, limited interaction, everybody survives. Then the innkeeper, a cheerful woman named Marcy who looked far too pleased for someone delivering terrible news, explained that a booking error had left them with 1 available cabin. 1. Singular. Shared. Caleb laughed because he assumed she was joking. Ethan did not laugh, which made it worse. Outside, the first thunder rolled over the mountains. Inside, Marcy handed them 1 brass key attached to a wooden maple leaf and said, "Good news is, it has heat." Caleb looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the key. Neither of them looked at the bed situation yet, which, in hindsight, was the last peaceful moment they had. The cabin had looked charming from the outside, which Caleb later decided was how all disasters introduced themselves in Vermont. It sat at the edge of the festival grounds beneath a cluster of red maples, with a little porch, a stack of firewood, and a wreath made of dried corn husks hanging on the door. For 1 dangerous second, Caleb thought maybe sharing a cabin with Ethan Miller would be manageable. Then Ethan stepped inside, turned on every lamp, inspected the corners of the ceiling, tested the window locks, and said, "The sofa is structurally questionable." Caleb dropped his duffel bag beside the door and stared at him. Most people say hello to a room before diagnosing it. Ethan crouched beside the small plaid sofa and pressed 1 hand against the wooden frame. Most people ignore warning signs until they become problems. That must look great on a dating profile. Ethan looked over his shoulder, expression calm. "I would not know." Caleb should have left that alone. He absolutely did not. "You have never dated? Or you have never had a profile?" Ethan stood, brushed invisible dust from his jeans, and said, "Yes." Somehow, that 1 word annoyed Caleb more than an entire paragraph would have. The cabin had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, 1 tiny kitchen, 1 fireplace, and, after Ethan lifted the bedroom door open, with the solemnity of a man discovering a crime scene, 1 bed. Caleb leaned into the doorway beside him and gave the room a bright, hopeless smile. "Great. Cozy. Very American small-town nightmare." Ethan set his suitcase down with irritating precision. "I can sleep on the sofa." The structurally questionable sofa. The floor, then. Caleb glanced at Ethan's 6-foot frame, then at the braided rug in front of the fireplace. "You are going to fold yourself onto that rug like a tax document. It is for 1 night." It is for 3 nights. Ethan's jaw tightened by half an inch, which Caleb was beginning to understand was his version of screaming. They agreed to postpone the sleeping arrangement crisis and focus on work, because denial was apparently the foundation of adult life. Outside, the Maple and Hearth Festival was trying very hard to pretend a storm was not coming. Volunteers tied orange banners to lamp posts. A retired teacher arranged pie contest cards beneath a tent. A teenage brass band practiced the same cheerful chorus badly enough to make Caleb smile. He lifted his camera and began shooting, catching steam rising from paper cups of cider, flour on a baker's wrist, sunlight moving through jars of honey. Ethan watched in silence for a while before stepping beside him and quietly angling a wooden sign 3 inches to the left. Caleb lowered the camera. "Did you just improve my composition without asking?" "Yes." "Rude." "Effective." Caleb looked through the lens again and hated that Ethan was right. The shot was warmer now, balanced without feeling staged. A little later, Caleb noticed families walking past Ethan's main seating area instead of stopping. The benches were beautiful, arranged in clean lines beneath string lights, but they faced away from the food stalls, away from the music, away from everything that made people linger. Caleb pointed with his camera strap. "Your layout is elegant, but it does not invite anybody to stay." Ethan frowned. "It creates flow. It creates an airport lounge with pumpkins." For the first time all day, Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Then he moved one bench. Then another. By sunset, the space felt less like a design proposal and more like a place where someone might sit down with soup, laugh too loudly, and forget to check their phone. Caleb photographed it as the lights flickered on, and when he glanced over, Ethan was watching the people settle into the space with something soft and unguarded in his face. Caleb lifted the camera before he could stop himself. Ethan heard the shutter and turned. "Did you just take my picture?" Caleb shrugged. Visual memory. Ethan held his gaze for a moment, and the air between them changed so slightly Caleb could have pretended not to notice. But he did notice. That was the problem. By the time the last strand of string lights came on above the festival square, Caleb had taken 187 photos and deleted only 12, which he considered a personal victory. Ethan had moved 7 benches, rehung 2 chalkboard menus, adjusted the angle of a cider stand, and somehow convinced 3 volunteers to stop taping extension cords across walkways like invitations to disaster. Caleb watched him from beside a kettle corn booth, camera resting against his chest, and tried to pretend he was not impressed. It was easier to dislike Ethan when he existed as a sharp comment in a Boston conference room. All clean lines and cooler than you confidence. It was harder when Ethan knelt in damp grass to fix a loose table leg for an elderly vendor named Mrs. Donnelly, then accepted her payment of 1 apple hand pie with the serious gratitude of a man receiving an architectural award. Caleb lifted his camera again. Through the lens, Ethan looked different. Not cold. Careful. There was a difference, and Caleb did not like how much that difference mattered. "You are staring," Ethan said without looking up. Caleb lowered the camera too quickly. "I am documenting local wildlife." "Am I the wildlife?" "Rare, rigid, migrates toward problems." Ethan tightened the last screw on the table, then stood. "And you migrate toward pastry." Caleb looked down at the powdered sugar on his jacket. "That is called survival." Mrs. Donnelly laughed so hard she packed 2 extra hand pies into a napkin and gave them to Caleb with a wink that made Ethan look away as if eye contact with matchmaking grandmothers was outside his professional scope. The festival had softened as evening settled in. The mountains became dark blue shapes beyond the rooftops, and the air smelled like cinnamon, wet leaves, grilled cheese, and wood smoke. Families gathered around fire pits. A little girl in a yellow raincoat tried to teach her golden retriever to dance near the bandstand. Caleb moved through it all with his camera, catching small pieces of ordinary happiness before they disappeared. Ethan followed at a polite distance at first, then closer, carrying a roll of tape, 2 spare bulbs, and Caleb's second lens after Caleb nearly set it down on a hay bale and forgot it existed. "I had a system," Caleb said when Ethan handed it back. "Your system was abandoning expensive equipment near decorative farm materials. Creative people work with chaos. Successful creative people label their bags." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, but a gust of wind snapped one of the banners loose above the soup stall. Ethan reached for it at the same time Caleb did, and their hands bumped around the ribbon. It was nothing, barely a touch, but Caleb felt it with embarrassing clarity, maybe because Ethan froze for half a second before stepping back. "You take it," Ethan said. His voice was even, but softer than before. Caleb tied the banner down while pretending the back of his neck was not warm. 10 minutes later, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Vendors rushed to cover baskets and trays. Volunteers grabbed tablecloths and signs. Caleb tucked his camera under his jacket and helped a teenager rescue paper lanterns from the wind. Ethan appeared beside him with a tarp, calm in the kind of way that made panic feel slightly unnecessary. They worked without discussing it, shoulder to shoulder, Caleb gathering, Ethan securing, both of them moving through the messy urgency like they had practiced. By the time the square was safe from the weather, Caleb's hair was damp, his shoes were muddy, and Ethan's perfectly folded sleeves had lost their battle against reality. Caleb looked at him and laughed. Ethan glanced down at himself. "What? You look human." Ethan's mouth curved, not almost this time, but fully. Small, brief, and real. Caleb felt that smile land somewhere dangerously close to his heart. Then thunder rolled over the hills, the lights flickered, and Marcy came running from the inn with bad news written all over her face. The storm had knocked out power in half the property. A tree branch had cracked the window in their cabin bedroom, and until morning, the safest place for them was the smaller backup cabin behind the old sugar house. Marcy pressed a new key into Ethan's hand and looked apologetic. "It is warm, dry, and clean," she said. "But I need to warn you boys about one thing." Caleb already knew. Of course he knew. Life had a sense of humor, and tonight it had chosen him. "There is only one bed," Marcy finished. Ethan closed his eyes for one long second. Caleb hugged his camera under his jacket and whispered, "The sofa died for nothing." The backup cabin behind the old sugar house looked as if it had been built by someone who believed privacy was a luxury and blankets solved everything. It was smaller than the first cabin, with one room, one narrow kitchen counter, one little bathroom, one fireplace, and one bed tucked beneath a slanted ceiling where rain whispered against the roof. Caleb stepped inside first, dripping onto the braided rug, and tried not to laugh because if he started, he might not stop. Ethan stood in the doorway with both duffel bags in his hands, his wet hair falling slightly over his forehead, looking at the room with the silent despair of a man who had just lost an argument with fate. "I can sleep by the fireplace," he said. Caleb turned, slowly. "Absolutely not. It is fine. It is a wood floor in October in Vermont. I have slept in worse conditions." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "That is not the reassuring sentence you think it is." Ethan set the bags down with careful control, but Caleb saw the small movement when Ethan rolled one shoulder, the faint wince he tried to hide. Earlier that afternoon, Ethan had lifted 3 benches, carried 2 crates of lanterns, and bent over a drafting board for hours like his spine was made of professional obligation. Caleb pointed at him. "You are doing that thing." "What thing?" "Pretending your body is a rental car." Ethan looked genuinely confused. "That is not a thing. It is when you drive it badly and hope no one checks for damage." A corner of Ethan's mouth twitched, but he still reached for the extra blanket folded on a chair. Caleb crossed the room, took it from him, and tossed it onto the bed. "We are adults. The bed is not a battlefield." Ethan stared at the quilt as if it might require a permit. "I do not want you to feel uncomfortable." Caleb's answer came out quieter than he expected. "Then stop acting like being near you is something I need protection from." That changed the air. Not dramatically, not like thunder. More like the moment a room grows still because someone has accidentally said something true. Ethan looked at him, and for once, Caleb could not read his expression as cold or careful. It was simply open, and that made Caleb look away first. They moved around the cabin in awkward peace after that. Caleb hung his damp jacket on the back of a chair. Ethan found matches in a tin box and coaxed the fireplace to life with patient hands. The flames caught slowly, filling the room with a warm amber glow that softened the plain wooden walls. Caleb set his camera bag on the kitchen counter, then rescued the apple hand pies from his coat pocket, slightly crushed but still edible. He handed one to Ethan. Dinner, apparently. Ethan accepted it. Balanced meal. Fruit. Grain. Emotional support. They ate standing near the fireplace while rain stitched silver lines down the windows. For a few minutes, The whole world seemed reduced to firelight, pastry crumbs, and the strange comfort of not needing to perform for anyone. Caleb expected silence to make things worse, but it did not. Ethan's quiet had changed shape. It no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a porch light left on. When the power flickered once and went out completely, Caleb made a dramatic sound of betrayal. Ethan immediately found a flashlight in the emergency drawer. "Of course you found that in 4 seconds," Caleb said. "I checked the drawer when we came in." "You checked the emergency drawer before taking off your wet shoes. Preparedness prevents inconvenience." Caleb shook his head. "You are one laminated checklist away from becoming a national park ranger." Ethan finally laughed, a low, surprised sound that seemed to startle him as much as it startled Caleb. It was not big, but it was real, and Caleb felt himself smiling before he could stop. Later, after brushing their teeth side by side at the tiny sink and politely avoiding each other's eyes in the mirror, they stood on opposite sides of the bed like two negotiators at a peace summit. Ethan placed a pillow down the middle. Caleb stared at it. "Did you just build a border?" "A symbolic one." "Congratulations." "Very mature." They climbed in stiffly, each staying close to his own edge. The cabin settled around them. The fire cracked softly. Rain tapped the roof. Caleb stared into the dark and listened to Ethan breathing a few feet away, steady but not asleep. He knew because he was not asleep either. After several minutes, Ethan spoke into the darkness. "Caleb." "Yes." "Your photographs are not lacking purpose." Caleb blinked at the ceiling, suddenly unable to make a joke. Ethan continued, softer now. "I was wrong when I said that in Boston." Caleb swallowed. The room felt warmer than before. "Your spaces are not cold," he said. "I was wrong too." Neither of them said anything after that, but the pillow between them felt less like a border and more like something waiting to be moved. For a while, the darkness made honesty easier. Caleb did not have to watch Ethan's face, and Ethan did not have to decide what to do with his hands, so the truth came out in small, careful pieces, like coins dropped into a jar. Caleb told him about the unpaid invoices first, because money was less embarrassing than loneliness. He talked about the camera lens he had bought on credit, the book proposal sitting unfinished on his laptop, the food blog that looked successful online but barely covered rent in real life. He laughed after saying it, because laughing made failure sound less heavy. "People think freelance means freedom," Caleb said, staring at the ceiling. "Most days it means eating cereal for dinner and pretending the word exposure can pay an electric bill." Ethan was quiet for so long Caleb wondered if he had said too much. Then Ethan said, "My studio fund is in a savings account I have not touched in 2 years." Caleb turned his head slightly, though he could only see the outline of Ethan's profile in the firelight. "Why not?" Ethan breathed out slowly. "Because once I use it, the dream becomes measurable. Rent, permits, clients, failure. Right now it is still perfect because it has not happened." That answer settled between them with surprising weight. Caleb understood it too well, the strange safety of an unopened door. Outside, the storm pressed rain against the cabin windows. Inside, the pillow border had shifted when Caleb moved, leaving only a narrow ridge of cotton between their shoulders. "Is that why you plan everything?" Caleb asked. "So nothing can surprise you?" Ethan gave a soft sound that was not quite a laugh. "Something like that." "Did it work?" "No," Caleb smiled into the dark. "Good. I was worried you had beaten the human condition." Ethan was silent again, but this time Caleb could feel the smile in it. After a moment, Ethan said, "My last relationship ended because he said loving me felt like standing outside a beautiful house with all the lights on, but every door locked." Caleb's smile faded. The sentence was too specific to be something a person forgot. That was a cruel thing to say. It was an accurate thing to say. Those are not always the same. Ethan turned his head then. Caleb felt it more than saw it. "What about you?" Caleb wanted to dodge the question. He wanted to make a joke about being emotionally available to pastries and golden retrievers. Instead, maybe because of the rain, or the fire, or the fact that Ethan had apologized without making a performance of it, he told the truth. "I am easy to like when I am passing through," he said. "I am fun at weddings, good on road trips, great at making people laugh when the room gets too quiet. But staying is different. Staying means people see the mess. The late bills, the panic, the days I cannot make myself answer emails. I think I learned to leave first so no one had to ask." "Me too." The words made the cabin feel smaller. Ethan did not rush to fix them. He did not say Caleb was wrong or offer a motivational speech. He simply listened, and somehow that was worse, because it made Caleb feel seen without being cornered. "For what it is worth," Ethan said at last, "I do not think you are a mess." Caleb swallowed. "You met me yesterday. I have seen enough." That sounds like something a very confident man says before buying a haunted house. Ethan gave another quiet laugh, and the sound warmed Caleb more than the quilt. A gust of wind pushed against the cabin, rattling the window. Caleb flinched before he could stop himself. Ethan noticed, of course he noticed, but all he did was reach across the pillow and rest his hand palm up between them, an invitation with no demand inside it. Caleb looked at that hand for a long time. Then he placed his fingers lightly against Ethan's. Nothing dramatic happened. The storm did not stop. Music did not rise from nowhere. But Caleb's breathing changed, and Ethan's did too, both of them settling into the simple comfort of being allowed to be afraid beside someone else. Sometime later, Caleb drifted toward sleep with Ethan's hand still near his, close enough to find if the dark became too large. His last clear thought was that the cabin no longer felt like a problem to survive. It felt, impossibly, like shelter. Morning arrived quietly, as if it knew the night had already done enough. Caleb woke to gray-gold lights spreading across the cabin walls and the soft crackle of the fireplace fading into embers. For a few seconds, he did not remember where he was. Then he felt the quilt tucked carefully around his shoulders, smelled coffee somewhere nearby, and saw Ethan standing at the tiny kitchen counter in yesterday's jeans and a clean white t-shirt, trying to butter toast with the tense concentration of a man performing surgery on bread. Caleb should have made a joke immediately. That was his usual defense, the first brick in the wall, the bright little sparkler he waved whenever a moment felt too honest. But his voice stayed caught in his throat. Ethan had pushed the pillow border to the floor sometime. During the night. Caleb did not remember when. He did remember the warmth of Ethan's hand near his, the rain against the glass, the strange relief of telling the truth and not being punished for it. Ethan glanced over and found him awake. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Then Ethan lifted the butter knife slightly. "I made breakfast." Caleb sat up, hair falling into his eyes. "Is toast considered breakfast, or is this another one of your minimalist design statements?" Ethan looked down at the plate. "There are also apples." "Ambitious." The corner of Ethan's mouth curved. "Do not get used to it." Caleb smiled, and it felt different from his usual smile, less like performance and more like sunlight finding a room. He climbed out of bed, only to discover one of his socks had vanished during the night. Ethan noticed him scanning the floor and silently pointed toward the lampshade, where the missing sock was hanging like a defeated flag. Caleb stared at it. "I have questions." "So do I," Ethan said. "But I decided not to ask them before coffee." The coffee was too strong, exactly as Caleb suspected it would be, but Ethan had added milk without being told. Not enough, but still. Caleb held the mug in both hands and tried not to let that small act rearrange his entire heart. They ate near the window while the storm washed itself out over the hills. Outside, the festival grounds looked freshly painted, every pumpkin brighter, every maple leaf shining with rain. Ethan unfolded a damp blueprint on the table, checking what had to be repaired before the afternoon events. Caleb reached for his camera, meaning only to check the battery, but then Ethan leaned over the plan, morning light tracing the slope of his cheek, one hand wrapped around his coffee, the other smoothing wrinkled paper with gentle patience. Caleb lifted the camera and took the picture. Ethan looked up at the click. Again, Caleb lowered the camera slowly. "You keep standing in good light. That is on you." Ethan held his gaze, and this time he did not ask Caleb to delete it. That felt like permission, not just for the photograph, but for something neither of them was ready to name. The rest of the morning unfolded with a delicate awkwardness that somehow made everything sweeter. Caleb burned the second round of toast because he was too busy watching Ethan fix the crooked curtain rod with a butter knife. Ethan tried to compliment Caleb's photography and accidentally made it sound like a museum label. Caleb laughed until Ethan rolled his eyes, then helped him rewrite the sentence into something human. By 10 o'clock, Marcy arrived in a yellow raincoat to say their original cabin had been repaired, but Caleb and Ethan both looked around the smaller room before answering. The unmade bed, the two mugs, the blueprints, the camera strap dangling from a chair, the sock still on the lampshade. It should have looked ridiculous. Instead, it looked lived in. "We can stay here until checkout tomorrow," Ethan said carefully. Caleb nodded, trying not to smile too much. "For logistical reasons. Obviously, because moving bags in mud is inefficient. Extremely inefficient." They stepped onto the porch together, the air cool and clean, the mountains wrapped in mist. Down at the festival square, volunteers were already setting things right again. Caleb raised his camera to capture the first beam of sun breaking through the clouds, but before he pressed the shutter, he glanced sideways at Ethan. Ethan was watching the same light, his face calm, his shoulders no longer held so tightly against the world. Caleb took the picture then, knowing it was not really about the sunrise. It was about proof that some mornings could arrive gently and still change everything. By noon, the festival had forgiven the storm. The puddles became mirrors for strings of lights. The wet hay smelled sweet beneath the tents, and the whole town seemed to move with the cheerful determination of people who believed maple syrup could solve most problems. Caleb should have been exhausted, but he felt strangely awake, as if the rain had rinsed something heavy out of him. He moved through the square with his camera, capturing children painting pumpkins, a father balancing 3 bowls of chowder, and Mrs. Donnelly laughing while Ethan helped rehang her pie contest banner with far more seriousness than any dessert-related object required. Every time Caleb looked through the lens and found Ethan in the frame, he told himself it was coincidence. Ethan adjusting a lantern. Ethan kneeling to steady a wobbly table. Ethan standing beneath red leaves with his sleeves rolled up, listening carefully while a vendor explained where foot traffic usually slowed. Coincidence, Caleb decided, had excellent bone structure and a habit of making his chest feel too full. By early afternoon, Caleb's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket while he was photographing cider donuts cooling on a wire rack. He almost ignored it, but the subject line made his hand freeze. "Congratulations, Caleb Brooks." The email was from a travel magazine based in Seattle, the one that had rejected him twice and then, apparently, changed its mind when his editor friend sent them a link to his small-town food series. They wanted him for a 6-month road assignment across the Northeast and Midwest, photographing family-owned diners, bakeries, farm stands, and roadside restaurants. It was the kind of job he had dreamed about while editing photos at 2 in the morning with instant noodles beside his laptop. It paid well. It came with publication credit. It could turn his unfinished book from a wish into a real thing. Caleb read the email 3 times, and each time, his excitement rose with a strange ache underneath it. 6 months. Different states, different motels, different mornings. No Vermont cabin. No shared coffee. No Ethan standing nearby like a safe place he had not meant to find. He was still staring at the screen when Ethan approached carrying a crate of extension cords. Good news. Caleb locked the phone too quickly. Maybe. Yes. Work thing. Ethan set the crate down. That is good. It is good. Caleb waited for himself to sound happier. He did not. Before Ethan could ask more, Marcy called him toward the main tent, and Caleb escaped in emotion because motion had always been easier than conversation. For the next hour, he photographed everything except Ethan. That was how he knew he was in trouble. Near 3 o'clock, he found Ethan behind the maple candy booth, speaking quietly with Marcy and one of the festival coordinators. Caleb stopped before they saw him, not meaning to listen, but then he heard his own name. Caleb has real talent, Ethan said. If this assignment is what I think it is, he should take it. Marcy asked something too softly for Caleb to hear. Ethan answered after a pause. After this weekend, things should go back to normal. He has a career to build. I do not want him making choices because of one strange weekend in a cabin. Caleb stepped back as if the wet ground had shifted under him. The words were reasonable. Kind, even. That was the worst part. Ethan was not rejecting him with cruelty. He was doing it with maturity, with distance, with that careful locked-door voice Caleb suddenly recognized. Normal. The word landed harder than it should have. Caleb had spent years being the person people enjoyed temporarily, the bright interruption, the passing-through boy with a camera and a joke ready before anyone noticed his hands shaking. He had thought last night meant Ethan saw more than that. Maybe Ethan had seen it and decided not to keep looking. When Ethan found him 20 minutes later near the bandstand, Caleb was photographing a toddler wearing sunglasses upside down and laughing too loudly at the child's attempt to feed a cracker to a wooden scarecrow. "You disappeared," Ethan said. Caleb kept the camera raised. "Occupational hazard. Photographers are basically ghosts with invoices." "Caleb." The softness in Ethan's voice almost ruined him, so Caleb smiled brighter. "Big news, actually. I might be leaving soon for a magazine job. 6 months. Road trip glamour. Cheap coffee. Questionable motel art. The American dream." Ethan's face changed, pride and something like sadness crossing it, before he controlled both. "You should take it." Caleb nodded, even though his throat had tightened. "Yeah, I figured you would say that." Ethan frowned slightly. "It is an important opportunity, right? Logistical. Efficient. No reason to overcomplicate things." He turned away before Ethan could answer, pretending to chase better light near the food trucks. Behind him, the festival kept glowing, warm and alive, but Caleb felt the first cold edge of evening arrive early. For the rest of the day, he gave everyone his best version of cheerful. He made vendors laugh, complimented homemade chili, helped a little boy find his lost mitten, and took some of the best photographs of his career. Not one of them had Ethan in it. By the time evening settled over the festival, Caleb had become very good at pretending. He pretended the orange lanterns strung between the maple trees did not remind him of the firelight in the cabin. He pretended the smell of cinnamon and smoke did not make him remember Ethan's quiet voice in the dark. He pretended the empty space beside him did not feel shaped exactly like a person who measured windows, rescued camera lenses, and added milk to coffee without being asked. The final event of the night was a small community showcase inside the renovated barn at the edge of the festival grounds, where local artists, vendors, and photographers displayed work from the weekend. Caleb had not planned to include anything personal. He printed safe images at the town copy shop: cider donuts, pie crusts, muddy boots, laughing children, hands pouring syrup over pancakes. Good work. Warm work. Work that would help him get the magazine job if the right person saw it online. Then, at the very bottom of his camera roll, he found the photograph from that morning. Ethan at the table in the backup cabin, leaning over a wrinkled blueprint in soft gray light, one hand smoothing paper, the other curled around coffee. The bed behind him was unmade. Caleb's camera strap hung from a chair. 2 mugs sat too close together near a plate of burned toast. Nothing about the image was dramatic, but Caleb could not stop looking at it. It was not a portrait of Ethan as the cool designer everyone saw. It was a portrait of rest, of shelter, of a man who had forgotten to lock the door for a moment. Caleb almost deleted it. Instead, he printed it. He placed it at the end of his display and wrote the title by hand on a small card, "The Room That Felt Safe." He told himself Ethan would not see it. Of course, Ethan saw it. Caleb noticed him from across the barn, standing still in his dark green sweater among the chatter of townspeople and the soft bluegrass music from a corner speaker. Ethan looked at the photo for a long time. Too long. Caleb's stomach tightened, and he turned away, busying himself with a crooked frame that did not need fixing. A few minutes later, Marcy tapped a spoon against a cider glass and invited Ethan to say a few words about the festival redesign. Ethan stepped to the front with a folded note card in his hand. Caleb braced himself for clean sentences about pathways, vendor flow, and community engagement. Ethan looked down at the card, then at the people gathered under the barn lights, then at Caleb. Slowly, he folded the card in half and put it in his pocket. "I came here thinking good design was about control," Ethan began, his voice steady but different, less polished. "Clear routes, balanced spaces, nothing wasted, nothing uncertain." A few people nodded, smiling politely. Ethan's eyes found Caleb again. "But this weekend reminded me that the best places are not perfect. They are the places where people feel welcome enough to stay." A bench turned toward music. A booth moved closer to the smell of soup. A small cabin that becomes warmer because 2 people stop trying so hard to protect themselves from being known. Caleb forgot how to breathe. The barn seemed to grow quiet around him, though maybe that was only his own heart making too much noise. Ethan continued, softer now. "Someone told me today that my spaces are not cold. I think he was being generous. But I am learning. Some rooms change because of light. Some change because of laughter. And some change because someone sees you clearly and still chooses to remain kind." He paused, and for the first time since Caleb had met him, Ethan looked nervous. Not weak. not uncertain in a way that made him smaller. Just human. I told someone he should take a job because I did not want to become the reason he stayed. I forgot that there is a difference between setting someone free and making him feel unwanted. Caleb's eyes stung before he could stop them. Ethan looked directly at him now. So I would like to correct that. Caleb, I hope you take the assignment. I hope you photograph every diner, bakery, farm stand, and roadside place that makes you believe in people. I hope your book becomes real. But if you ever want a place to come back to, I would like to build one with you. Slowly. Honestly. No locked doors. No one cheered at first, because the moment was too gentle for noise. Then Mrs. Donnelly sniffed loudly, which somehow broke the spell, and the whole barn softened into applause. Caleb laughed under his breath, wiping at one eye with the heel of his hand. Ethan stepped down, and when he reached him, Caleb did not make a joke. He simply took Ethan's hand, right there among the photographs and cider cups and maple leaves tracked across the floor, and held on. They stayed in the barn until the lanterns burned low and the last families drifted into the cold Vermont night, carrying pie boxes, damp jackets, and sleepy children wrapped in scarves. Caleb and Ethan did not say much at first. They stood near Caleb's photographs with their hands still linked, quiet in the middle of a room that had suddenly become both too public and exactly right. When Marcy walked by pretending not to cry, Caleb finally laughed, and Ethan looked at him with such open relief that the ache in Caleb's chest loosened. Outside, the sky had cleared. Stars scattered above the dark mountains, bright and sharp after the storm, and the festival grounds smelled like wet leaves, wood smoke, and sugar. They walked back to the little cabin without rushing. Caleb's camera bumped against his hip. Ethan carried the framed photograph under one arm because Caleb had shoved it at him and said, "You are not allowed to be emotionally profound and leave without your evidence." Ethan had accepted it with a seriousness that made Caleb want to smile for the rest of his life. At the cabin, neither of them pretended the room was ordinary anymore. The unmade bed, the crooked curtain rod, the sock still somehow hanging from the lampshade, all of it had become part of the story they would never be able to explain without sounding ridiculous. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed while Ethan leaned the photograph against the wall beside his blueprints. "I am still taking the job," Caleb said softly. Ethan nodded. "I know. 6 months is a long time." "Yes. I am bad at returning messages when I get overwhelmed. I am bad at not sounding like a business email when I am worried." Caleb looked at him, and Ethan looked back, and then they both laughed because for once the truth did not feel like a warning. It felt like instructions for how to care for each other properly. They made no impossible promises that night. No grand speeches. No dramatic plans to rearrange their lives by sunrise. They talked about simple things. Phone calls on Sundays. Postcards from weird roadside diners. Ethan sending pictures of old houses he wanted to restore. Caleb sending voice notes whenever he found the best pancake in a new state. Before they slept, Ethan moved the pillow border to the chair without asking. Caleb noticed and said nothing, but his smile gave him away. 1 month later, Caleb left for the assignment in a borrowed blue Subaru with snow tires Ethan had insisted on checking twice. Ethan did not ask him to stay. Caleb did not ask Ethan to wait. Instead, at the edge of the festival parking lot where the maples had gone bare, Ethan handed him a travel mug of coffee with the correct amount of milk this time and said, "Come back with stories." Caleb said, "Build something worth photographing." They did both. Winter stretched across New England in white roads, neon diner signs, motel heaters, and photographs that made strangers feel familiar. Caleb sent Ethan pictures of blueberry pie in Maine, a 60-year-old lunch counter in Ohio, and a tiny bakery in Michigan where the owner named every sourdough starter after a former president. Ethan sent Caleb sketches of a small studio space in Burlington, then pictures of dust, paint samples, exposed brick, and one very ugly chair he claimed had potential. Some nights they missed each other so much the distance felt like weather. Some nights they argued about nothing because being brave did not make them perfect. But they kept choosing the conversation after the misunderstanding, the call after the silence, the open door after the fear. 6 months later, Caleb returned to Vermont during the first warm week of spring. The studio was above an old bookstore with wide windows, pale wood floors, and sunlight falling across 2 desks placed side by side. On one wall hung Caleb's photograph from the cabin. Beneath it, Ethan had written a note on a small white card. A room becomes a home when someone is allowed to return. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment, his suitcase at his feet, his heart too full for jokes. Ethan waited by the window, nervous and hopeful, still learning how to leave the lights on and the doors unlocked. Caleb crossed the room and set his camera on the empty desk beside Ethan's. It was not the end of the journey. It was better than that. It was the beginning of a life with enough space for both of them to grow, leave, return, fail, laugh, try again, and finally understand that love was not a place that trapped you. Love was the place that made you want to come home.